Holloway's Pharmacy was a relic from another era, a family-owned establishment that had stood in the heart of the town for over a century. The exterior of the building was quaint, with large, old-fashioned windows and a wooden sign creaking overhead, adorned with fading gold letters that spelled out the name. Inside, the shelves were stocked with a mixture of modern pharmaceuticals and nostalgic remedies, glass bottles of tonics, hand-labeled ointments, and dusty jars filled with mysterious herbs. The scent of the place was a peculiar blend of antiseptic, old wood, and something faintly floral, as if the air itself had absorbed decades of history. For many in the town, Holloway's was a comforting presence, a place where generations had gone to seek remedies for their ailments. But there was another side to the pharmacy that few spoke of, a dark history whispered about in hushed tones among the older residents. They would talk of strange occurrences, of employees who had left without a word, and of the peculiar sounds that could be heard echoing through the building late at night. Lara, a young pharmacy technician, was new in town and unaware of the stories. She had taken the job at Holloway's to help pay her way through college. The pay was decent, and the hours were flexible, allowing her to study during the quieter parts of her shifts. But the one part of the job she dreaded was the midnight shift. The midnight shift at Holloway's was a strange tradition, a holdover from the days when the pharmacy had been the town's only medical resource. Despite the town now having a hospital and several other pharmacies, the old man who owned Holloway's insisted on keeping the place open 24/7, just as his father and grandfather had done. The midnight shift was usually quiet, with only the occasional customer, usually someone in need of a late-night remedy for a sick child or an insomniac looking for something to help them sleep. On the night Lara was scheduled to work her first solo midnight shift, a heavy storm rolled in. The rain battered the old windows and the wind howled through the narrow streets outside. As she arrived at the pharmacy, she noticed how deserted the town seemed. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the pavement. Lara pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of the pharmacy greeted her, but tonight it felt different, more oppressive, as if the air was thick with anticipation. She flicked on the lights, which buzzed softly as they illuminated the aisles. The old building creaked as it settled, the sound echoing through the empty space. She made her way to the back counter, where she settled in for what she expected would be a long, quiet night. After checking the inventory and making sure everything was in order, Lara pulled out her textbook, trying to focus on her studies. But as the hours passed, the storm outside intensified, and the wind began to sound less like a natural force and more like a distant, mournful wail. Around midnight, just as Lara was beginning to doze off, a loud crash jolted her awake. Her heart raced as she looked around, trying to locate the source of the noise. It seemed to have come from the storeroom at the back of the pharmacy, a place she had always found unsettling. The storeroom was a labyrinth of shelves, stacked high with boxes and jars, many of which hadn't been touched in years. Reluctantly, Lara grabbed her flashlight and made her way to the back of the store. The door to the storeroom was slightly ajar, and she hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing row upon row of dusty shelves. The air was colder here, and she could see her breath misting in front of her. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response, only the sound of the rain pounding against the roof. Lara stepped inside, her footsteps echoing loudly in the confined space. As she moved deeper into the storeroom, she spotted a stack of boxes that had toppled over, spilling their contents across the floor. She sighed in relief, convincing herself that the storm had shaken the building and caused the boxes to fall. Kneeling down, she began to gather up the scattered items. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The tiny hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But each time she turned, the room was empty. Just as she was finishing up, a cold breeze brushed past her, making her shiver. She froze, flashlight in hand, listening intently. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, pressing in on her from all sides. And then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakably there. "Lara." She whipped around, her flashlight sweeping across the room, but there was no one there. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood up, backing slowly toward the door. The whisper came again, this time clearer. "Lara, help me." Panicking, Lara turned and bolted out of the storeroom, slamming the door shut behind her. She leaned against it, breathing heavily, trying to calm herself down. "It's just the storm," she muttered to herself. "You're imagining things." But even as she tried to rationalize it, she knew what she had heard. The voice had been real. Too real. And it had known her name. She hurried back to the front counter, her eyes darting around the store. The warm, comforting atmosphere of the pharmacy had turned sinister, the shadows seeming to move on their own. Lara checked the time, just after 1 a.m. She had 5 more hours to go. Trying to shake off her fear, she decided to distract herself by restocking the shelves. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every creak of the old building, every flicker of the lights, sent her heart racing. She kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to fly open and reveal something horrible on the other side. At 2 a.m., the front doorbell chimed, signaling that someone had entered the store. Lara jumped, nearly dropping the bottle she was holding. She hadn't heard anyone approach, and the streets outside had been deserted all night. "Hello," she called out, stepping toward the front of the store. There was no response. The door had closed behind the customer, but no one was in sight. She checked the aisles, her heart pounding in her chest. The store was empty. Confused and growing increasingly uneasy, Lara returned to the counter. She tried to focus on her book, but the words swam in front of her eyes, refusing to make sense. She glanced up at the security monitor, which displayed the camera feeds from around the store. Most of the screens showed nothing but empty aisles, but one caught her attention. It was the camera positioned near the front door. The feed was static, the picture fuzzy and distorted. But through the interference, she could make out a figure standing just inside the door, a tall, shadowy silhouette that seemed to be staring directly at the camera. Lara's blood ran cold. She stared at the monitor, her mind racing. The figure didn't move, didn't react to anything. It just stood there, watching. Then, without warning, the screen went black. Lara's breath caught in her throat as she frantically tried to get the feedback, but the monitor remained dark. A few seconds later, the lights in the pharmacy began to flicker, casting the store in a strobe-like effect. Shadows danced wildly on the walls and the temperature plummeted. Terrified, Lara grabbed the phone and dialed the number for the night manager, Mr. Holloway. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. She hung up and tried again, but the line went dead before it even connected. Just as she was about to give up and run out of the store, the lights went out completely, plunging the pharmacy into darkness. Lara fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking so badly that she nearly dropped it. When she finally managed to turn it on, the beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the rows of shelves that seemed to stretch on endlessly. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound began to echo through the store. growing louder with each passing second. Laura's breath came in shallow gasps as she swept the flashlight around, trying to locate the source of the noise. The tapping grew louder and more insistent, like someone was knocking on wood, but there was no one there. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, oppressive in its stillness. Laura could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, and she was acutely aware of how alone she was. Suddenly, the tapping resumed, this time directly behind her. Laura spun around, her flashlight beam revealing the source, an old-fashioned wooden chair in the corner of the store, rocking back and forth on its own. She screamed, stumbling backward, her flashlight flickering wildly. The chair continued to rock, the tapping sound filling the air. And then she saw it. Out of the corner of her eye, a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the aisle watching her. She turned the flashlight toward it, but the beam passed through empty air. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there. But Laura knew what she had seen. Panicking, she backed away, moving toward the front of the store. The tapping sound followed her, growing louder and more frantic. She reached the door and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She pulled and pulled, but it was as if the door was sealed shut. Desperate, Laura turned to run toward the back exit, but her path was blocked by the figure. It stood in the center of the aisle, its features hidden in shadow. But she could feel its gaze on her, cold and unrelenting. "Who are you?" Laura whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, unmoving, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Then, slowly, it raised one hand and pointed toward the back of the store. Terrified, but with no other option, Laura turned and ran. She sprinted down the aisle, her footsteps echoing loudly in the darkened store. The tapping sound followed her, growing louder and faster, like a heartbeat racing out of control. She reached the back door and threw it open, stumbling out into the alley behind the pharmacy. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the air was thick with mist. Laura didn't stop running until she was several blocks away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she finally dared to look back, the pharmacy was a dark silhouette against the night sky. The lights inside had come back on, casting an eerie glow through the windows. And in one of those windows, she saw the figure again watching her. Laura didn't go back to Holloway's pharmacy. She quit her job the next day, unable to explain what had happened that night. She told herself it was just a nightmare, a figment of her imagination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But deep down, she knew the truth. Holloway's pharmacy was haunted by something old and malevolent, something that had been waiting in the shadows for years. And it had found her. Months later, after she had moved to a new town and started a new life, Laura still couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every so often, she would catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure out of the corner of her eye, standing just at the edge of her vision. And sometimes, late at night, she would hear it, the soft, rhythmic tapping that had haunted her that night in the pharmacy, reminding her that some doors once opened can never truly be closed.